before empires rise, they are dreamt. One night, in a simple lodge warmed by prayer and the whisper of old songs, Osman dreamed a dream that would echo across centuries. From his chest sprang a great tree. Its roots sank deep into the earth and its branches stretched to touch the skies. Beneath its shade flourished rivers, cities, and kingdoms as far as the eye could see. The world itself seemed sheltered by its embrace. It was no idle vision. This was destiny speaking in the language of dreams. And Osman would answer. That night, in the quiet town of Inegol, the seed of an empire was planted. An empire whose dynasty would rule longer than any other continuous sovereign line in history, holding full power for over 6 centuries. The tree had not yet grown, but the ground was ready, and Osman was waking. Long before dreams became banners and empires, Osman was simply a boy of the frontier. Born into the tents of the Kayu tribe around 1258, he grew up in Soyut, a settlement perched between the crumbling Byzantine Empire and the weakening Seljuk Sultanate. Here, survival was a daily negotiation with fate. The Kayu were one of the 24 original Oghuz Turkic clans, claiming descent from the legendary Oghuz Khan himself. Their symbol, the double bow, was a mark of nobility and a reminder of their proud, ancient lineage. By the time of Osman's birth, the Kayu had already endured centuries of migration, war, and survival, moving westward from the Central Asian steppes to the chaotic frontiers of Anatolia. In the turbulence of the 13th century, they found themselves settled under Seljuk protection, tasked with defending the borders against Byzantine forces and rival beyliks. Though modest in number, the Kayu enjoyed a reputation for loyalty, martial prowess, and an unbreakable spirit. Under the leadership of Osman's father, Ertuğrul, the Kayu had carved out a fragile yet respected position on the frontier. They were frontier guardians, small but strategic, fierce but pragmatic. Osman listened to the old tales of the steppes, of ancient heroes, endless migrations, and the dream of a homeland. He learned early that true leadership was not a birthright. It was a prize claimed by courage, wisdom, and faith. Among his mentors was Sheikh Edebali, a revered Sufi master of likely Turkic origin, later honored by tradition as a Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Edebali's teachings planted the seeds of a different kind of rule, one based not only on strength, but on justice and divine purpose. The boy raised among tents and frontier winds would soon be tested by forces greater than his tribe. In a land where empires crumbled like dust, Osman would carve his own destiny. When Ertuğrul passed away around 1280, a succession crisis loomed. Among the Kayu, leadership was not automatically passed to the eldest son. Instead, a new bey, the tribal chief, had to prove his worth. Several figures, including Osman's elder brother Saru, Batu, Savcı Bey, were natural candidates. Savcı, older and respected, seemed the obvious choice to many. Another contender was Dündar Bey, Osman's uncle, a senior figure who prized caution and stability over bold ambition. But the frontier demanded more than seniority. It demanded vision. While Savcı had experience, Osman had the loyalty of the younger warriors and Ghazis, Muslim frontier fighters driven by the ideal of holy struggle, Gaza. His bravery in raids, his alliance with spiritual leaders like Edebali, and his ability to inspire hope tipped the scales. Still, the leadership question remained unsettled. Tensions simmered, waiting for events to decide what debate could not. In many ways, the transition of leadership among the Kaya was a kind of natural selection, a brutal, unspoken contest where only the most adaptable, daring, and visionary could prevail. This was not unusual. Among the Turkic and Mongol peoples for centuries, leadership was often decided not by birth order, but by strength, charisma, and the ability to command loyalty in times of chaos. Blood ties gave a claim, but survival and victory sealed it. On the chaotic frontier, survival demanded more than pedigree. It demanded the kind of relentless spirit that could turn chaos into opportunity. In the midst of this uncertainty, a traditional account tells of another dramatic twist. Osman's growing raids on Byzantine territories provoked complaints to the Seljuk Sultan, Alaeddin Kaykubat III. Summoned to Konya to answer for his actions, Osman was arrested and brought before the Sultan. Rather than punishing him, the Sultan, influenced by advisors, sent Osman to the court of Hacı Bektaş Veli, a revered Sufi mystic. According to tradition, Hacı Bektaş Veli saw in Osman a light of destiny. In a symbolic act, he wrapped his own turban around Osman's head, a gesture signifying spiritual approval and leadership. Returning to Konya with Hacı Bektaş's blessing, Osman gained the Sultan's favour. Whether fact or legend, the story reflects a greater truth. Osman's rise was sanctified not only by sword and tribe, but by the spirit of faith. Meanwhile, fate dealt with rivals. In the Battle of Armenia Belli, Osman fought fiercely against Byzantine forces. Among the fallen was his elder brother Safça Bey, who died in battle defending their people. With Safça gone, one major rival to Osman's leadership vanished. Another challenge soon emerged. Dündar Bey, alarmed by Osman's ambitions, reportedly sought to curb his nephew's aggressive campaigns. According to early Ottoman chronicles, Dündar's resistance grew into rebellion, forcing Osman to make a painful decision. Drawing his sword, Osman executed Dündar. Stark, brutal act to secure the tribe's future. Thus, by blood, by trial, by blessing, and by sheer necessity, Osman emerged as the undisputed bey of the Kaya. In time, however, the Ottomans would abandon this harsh tradition. As the empire grew and matured, succession became increasingly based on seniority, the principle of the eldest surviving male ascending to the throne, stabilizing the imperial line, but sacrificing some of the wild dynamism that had once built it. The dream that had once stirred in the campfires of his youth was now entrusted to his hands. Osman reimagined what it meant to be a leader on the frontier. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also something more. A builder, a protector, a visionary. In a land where power often came from the sword alone, Osman understood that enduring power needed roots. Roots in faith, in trade, in law, and in people's hearts. Guided by the wisdom of Sheikh Edebali, Osman forged a principality not just through conquest, but through conviction. His marriage to Bala Hatun, Edebali's daughter, sealed a powerful alliance between the sword and the spiritual order. It was more than a political move. It was a declaration that his rule would be blessed not merely by force, but by divine purpose. On the fractured Byzantine frontier, Osman faced an array of rivals. The Tekfuls, Byzantine governors of crumbling fortresses, each ruling their small domains like isolated kings. Some sought peace through treaties, others plotted war. Osman, ever pragmatic, navigated this volatile world with both diplomacy and daring. He traded with Byzantine towns when it suited him, and raided their strongholds when opportunity demanded. Söğüt, once a modest village, began to transform under his leadership. Markets flourished. welcoming merchants from distant lands. Scholars and Sufi mystics found safe haven. Warriors rallied to his banner, drawn not just by the promise of spoils, but by a leader who spoke of destiny and justice. In a pivotal act of sovereignty, Osman instituted the khutbah, the Friday sermon, in his name. This act came not immediately but gradually as the authority of the Seljuk Sultanate faded into formality. For decades, the Seljuks had served as the nominal overlords of Anatolia's Muslim beyliks. But their weakening under Mongol pressure left a vacuum. As the sultans in Konya grew silent and symbolic, Osman's actions became bolder, and reading the khutbah in his name marked a shift from vassal to sovereign. In Islamic tradition, the khutbah was more than a prayer. It was a public proclamation of legitimate rule. To hear the preacher invoke a leader's name from the pulpit was to recognize him as the rightful authority over the land and its people. By this simple but powerful gesture, Osman sent a message to friend and foe alike. A new order was rising, and its roots ran deep. Osman's principality was still small, a fragile spark amid the ruins of empires. But in the wilderness of western Anatolia, a new kind of beylik had taken shape, not built on plunder alone, but on the belief that something lasting could grow from the dust. And Osman was determined that it would. The frontier was not a place for the faint of heart, and Osman's first major trial came swiftly. Around 1284, on the rugged hills and narrow passes of Armenia Belli, Osman faced his first great battlefield. A coalition of Byzantine forces, led by hostile Tekfurs, descended upon the Kaya. The sky was grey, the wind dry, and the earth churned beneath the hooves of horses and the cries of warriors. It is important to note, this battle was not fought over a castle, a town, or a specific territory. It was a clash for survival and influence, born from the Byzantine anxiety over Osman's growing power. The winner of the Battle of Armenia Belli remains unclear in historical records. No decisive victory was claimed by either side. But in the aftermath, the odds tilted undeniably in Osman's favour. Among the fallen was Osman's elder brother, Saru Batu Savci Bey, a respected and experienced figure who might once have rivaled Osman for leadership. His death was not just a family sorrow, it reshaped the destiny of the tribe. Savci's fall silenced any lingering doubts. There would be no more hesitation over leadership. Osman, still young, but already hardened by raids and hardship, now stood as the unchallenged bey of the Kayi. The battle left scars on Osman's soul, but also lessons in strategy and survival. He honed his tactics, swift cavalry raids, ambushes, feigned retreats, and an almost instinctive mastery of the terrain. Warfare was not just force, it was movement, patience, and deception. These were not random attacks. They were the first strokes of a far greater painting. A principality carved not only by swords, but by the art of seizing opportunity. The frontier lords, both Byzantine and Turkic, watched carefully. In this boy bey from Soud, they began to glimpse something troubling and extraordinary. A leader who knew how to turn grief into resolve and blood into banners. The frontier had tested Osman, and Osman had survived. The clan leader of Soud had faced the storm and walked through it scarred, but standing. The Byzantines had learned his name. The frontier had felt his fire, and Osman, now unchallenged at the head of the Kaya, was no longer merely defending a tribe. He was shaping a future. But this was only the beginning. because what lay ahead was not survival, but ambition. A vision whispered through dreams, etched in fire and oath, of a realm not yet born, and an empire still hidden beneath the dust of Anatolia. Victory at Armenia Belli had confirmed Osman's leadership, but it had not gifted him an empire. His real work began now, turning survival into sovereignty. In the years that followed, Osman set about weaving a true political and social fabric around his fragile beylik. Söğüt remained his heart, but its pulse now echoed farther into the valleys and hills of western Anatolia. Osman understood that conquest alone could not build a state. Stability demanded commerce, trust, and governance. He encouraged the growth of markets, welcomed craftsmen and merchants, and forged alliances through marriages and treaties. Caravan routes became lifelines, linking his fledgling domain with distant towns and trading posts. At the same time, Osman expanded his influence militarily, not through grand, sweeping battles, but through relentless skirmishes, careful sieges, and the slow, patient wearing down of his Byzantine neighbours. Each raid, each captured village, was a small stitch in a larger tapestry. One of Osman's early notable achievements was the capture of Kulukahisar, a strategic Byzantine fortress controlling trade routes. While the exact date remains debated, tradition holds that Osman used daring night attacks and surprise to seize the stronghold. Its fall sent shockwaves through the region, announcing that the Kayi were no longer mere frontier guardians. They were builders of a new order. With every success, warriors and dispossessed tribes flocked to Osman's banner. His principality became a magnet for those who sought both opportunity and purpose. The idea of Gaza, the sacred struggle, infused Osman's cause with a moral clarity that many found irresistible. Fighting for Osman was not merely about plunder, it was about being part of a destiny larger than oneself. Yet Osman moved with caution. He avoided premature open war against major Byzantine cities, preferring to consolidate his position, fortify his holdings, and prepare for greater tests ahead. In the rolling hills and shadowed valleys of Anatolia, Osman planted the seeds of an idea that from the broken bones of old empires, something new could grow, rooted in faith, sharpened by struggle, and nourished by hope. The realm was small, the dream was not, and Osman, ever patient, ever watchful, understood. To build an enduring house, one must first lay foundations deep enough to weather any storm. As the seasons turned and the frontier shifted, Osman's ambitions grew bolder. No longer content with mere survival or border raids, he now envisioned a domain that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the fallen glories around him. The Kayi Beylik, once a scattered camp of tents and hopes, was hardening into the framework of a state. The capture of Kulukahisar had changed the political map. Byzantine tekfurs, alarmed by Osman's growing power, formed uneasy alliances against him. Whispers of conspiracy passed from fortress to fortress. Skirmishes became sieges. Ambushes grew bloodier. Yet Osman did not falter. He adapted, using swift cavalry raids, surprise attacks, and carefully negotiated alliances with disaffected groups. Osman kept his enemies off balance. His forces struck across the Sakarya River and beyond, destabilizing Byzantine control in regions they had ruled for centuries. It was during this period that Osman's gaze fell upon Yenişehir, a fertile plain beyond the hills, nestled between key Byzantine strongholds. Controlling it would mean securing a rich agricultural heartland, a lifeline for the future expansion of his people. Bit by bit, Osman and his warriors gnawed at the edges of Byzantine domains. Small fortresses were taken, villages pledged their loyalty, and the old order slowly began to crumble. The old Tekfurs, desperate, sought to unite, but it was too late. A storm was rising, and its name was Osman. He was no longer merely the bey of a tribe. He was becoming the architect of a state. The small victories of Osman had not gone unnoticed. From the battered halls of Byzantine fortresses to the anxious camps of rival Turkish beyliks, a single truth began to whisper through the land. Osman was rising. Alarmed by his growing strength, the surrounding Byzantine Tekfurs, governors of towns like Inegöl, Bilecik, and Yarhisar, began to weave fragile alliances to contain him. Their fear was not just of a growing army, but of a growing idea that Anatolia's frontier might soon belong to a new master. Throughout the 1390s, the frontier hardened into a simmering war zone. Osman's tactics evolved. He no longer relied solely on raids, but began carefully orchestrating campaigns to isolate and weaken key Byzantine positions. Roads were cut, supplies intercepted, smaller forts harassed. His warriors, skilled in fast cavalry maneuvers and ambushes, turned the rugged terrain of Anatolia into a weapon. But the Tekfurs did not sit idle. They launched counterattacks, sometimes combining forces in uneasy alliances. Osman's forces faced sieges, ambushes, and betrayals. The struggle became one of endurance as much as courage. One by one, however, the cracks began to show in the Byzantine defences. Small but decisive battles, such as skirmishes near Inegöl and along the river crossings, tipped momentum toward Osman. The Tekfurs, divided by mistrust and jealousy, struggled to mount a coordinated resistance. Meanwhile, Osman strengthened his internal cohesion. He rewarded loyalty with land grants, established markets to stabilize his economy, and continued nurturing alliances with Sufi sheikhs, merchants, and displaced Ghazi warriors seeking a righteous cause. It was during these years that Osman's dream hardened into a plan, not merely survival, but supremacy. The frontier, once a chaotic patchwork of feuding lords, was beginning to tilt toward a single rising power. And soon, a blow would be struck. Not just a raid, but a conquest that would echo across the hills and valleys of Anatolia. The storm was no longer gathering, it was breaking. By the final years of the 13th century, the frontier had become a powder keg. Osman's growing power terrified the Byzantine governors. The Tekfurs of Bilecik, Yarhisar, and Inegöl. Determined to eliminate him, the Tekfurs hatched a scheme. They invited Osman to a grand wedding. The son of the Bilecik Tekfur was to marry the daughter of the Yarhisar Tekfur. Under the veil of celebration, they planned to ambush and assassinate the rising bey of the Kaya. But fortune favored Osman. Forewarned by Kusmihal, a Byzantine noble secretly sympathetic to Osman's cause, he saw through the trap, and he devised a counter-trap of his own. Feigning acceptance of the wedding invitation, Osman dispatched 40 of his finest warriors, disguised as porters carrying gifts and goods, into Bilecik. These men, hiding within the city, waited for their moment. At the same time, Osman ambushed the wedding procession itself. In the confusion, he captured the bride, Holofyra, daughter of the Yarhisar Tekfur, who would later embrace Islam and become known as Nilüfer Hatun, the wife of Orhan and the future mother of Sultan Murad. As the festivities devolved into fear, the hidden Kaya warriors struck inside Bilecik. The city, caught unprepared, fell without serious resistance. It was a masterpiece of cunning and daring. Following Bilecik's fall, Osman's forces swiftly moved to capture Yarhisa and İnegöl, tightening their hold on the frontier. Ironically, the Tekfurs, in their attempt to snuff out the spark of Osman's ambition, had, in fact, fueled a blaze that would consume empires. And without knowing it, they had delivered into Osman's hands not merely a fortress or a victory, but a future queen. From this unlikely union would descend one of the most enduring dynasties in history, a lineage that would command 3 continents and endure for 6 centuries. In trying to strangle the dream at birth, the Tekfurs unwittingly midwifed an empire. There had been many beys on the frontier, bold, brave, brilliant men, but there was a difference between a warlord and a sovereign, and that difference was declared, not with a sword, but with a prayer. When Osman ordered the khutbah, the Friday sermon, to be read in his name, it was a simple act by outward appearances. A few words altered, a few syllables shifted under the vaulted heavens. But in the world of medieval Islam, it was a revolution. For centuries, the khutbah had been spoken in the name of the rightful sovereign, the Seljuk Sultan, or beyond him, the Abbasid Caliph. To hear one's name woven into the sacred breath of Friday prayer was to step out of the shadows of vassalage and into the blinding light of kingship. At the time, Osman captured Bilecik, Yarhisa, and İnegöl. He was still a bey, a frontier leader among many, commanding loyalty more by reputation than decree. But with the khutbah, he declared that the age of borrowed crowns and distant suzerains was over. Osman was no longer merely the bey of the Kaya. He was, by faith and by the consent of his people, a sovereign ruler. This act signaled more than independence. It proclaimed a new legitimacy rooted in both divine favor and the right of conquest. It was a declaration not of rebellion, but of renewal. And fittingly, it would be Osman's descendants, not Osman himself, who would eventually wear the formal title of Sultan. Osman had no need for such embellishments. His sovereignty was written in the allegiance of his warriors, the prayers of his people, and the slow but steady growth of his realm. The khutbah had transformed him. From that moment, every conquest was no longer for a tribe, but for a state. Every treaty was no longer for survival, but for sovereignty. A dream had crossed a threshold, and a dynasty had taken its first, irreversible step into history. But sovereignty brought heavier burdens. The Byzantine Empire, desperate to stem the rising tide, sent armies to reclaim the lost frontiers. In 1301, at the Battle of Bapheus, Osman met them head-on. It was not a grand clash of empires, it was a collision of futures. Osman's warriors, swift horsemen, Ghazis hardened by years of frontier war, smashed the Byzantine lines. The imperial army, bloodied and broken, fled toward Nicomedia. For the first time, the corridors of Constantinople trembled at whispers of a new power rising beyond the Bosphorus. And Osman's eyes turned toward a prize greater than any he had yet claimed. Bursa, Bilecik and Yenişehir had been victories, no doubt about that. They were towns of strategic worth, footholds on the frontier, and symbols of Osman's growing reach. But Bursa was a different creature altogether. Bursa was no mere stronghold perched upon a hill or village nestled in a fertile plain. It was a city that breathed commerce, whispered with silk, and pulsed with the wealth of 2 worlds. Its bazaars connected caravans from Central Asia to the ships of the Aegean. It was the silk of the Silk Road, both a producer and a thriving hub of the silk trade that linked east and west. In truth, within Anatolia itself, only the fading grandeur of Konya, capital of the Seljuks, could rival it. And even Konya's brilliance had begun to dim under Mongol shadow. Beyond Konya, only the eternal, glittering majesty of Constantinople stood higher. To control Bursa would not merely be a conquest, it would be a coronation. It would signal that the Kayi were no longer mere frontier warlords scavenging the ruins of old empires. They were founders of a new one. Seizing Bursa meant cutting directly into the lifelines of imperial wealth, mastering the arteries of commerce that fed the very heart of Byzantine civilization. Capturing it would be no simple raid. It would demand patience, endurance, a slow siege, rather than a swift charge. In the years after Bapheus, Osman began to tighten his grip. Small fortresses and villages surrounding Bursa were taken, cutting off supplies and isolating the great city like a siege of roots, slowly strangling an ancient tree. Yet, as his dream neared its greatest triumph, Osman's body betrayed him. By the mid-1310s, illness struck. Some said it was the slow wasting of age. Others whispered of an old wound never healed. Whatever the cause, Osman could no longer ride, could no longer lead his Ghazis to the walls he had long coveted. And so, he turned to his son, Orhan. Orhan, raised among the clash of arms and the council of scholars, now carried the sword and standard. He would finish what Osman had begun. The final siege of Bursa, long and grinding, unfolded not with grand assaults, but with steady pressure. Food grew scarce within the walls. Morale withered. The city, once proud and rich, sagged beneath the weight of slow defeat. And as the sun set over the plains of Bithynia, Osman, frail, blind, perhaps already on his deathbed, listened as messengers brought him word. The banners of the Kaya now flew above the city he had dreamt of conquering. He had not lived to see it with his eyes, but he had seen it with his soul. The shepherd of tents had become the founder of cities. The dream had crossed the threshold of empire, and history, at last, had found a new axis. Osman did not die with a sword in his hand, but his name lived as though he had never let it go. As the siege of Bursa neared its end, Osman's condition worsened. His eyesight faded, his body withered, and he could no longer mount a horse or hold council with his commanders. And yet, in the minds of his people, his presence remained unshaken. A figure of endurance, faith, and vision. He had come far. From a frontier bay with little more than a loyal band of warriors and a dream, to the architect of a state that had outlived the Seljuks and cast its shadow over Byzantium. According to tradition, as the banners of the Kaya were raised over the walls of Bursa, Osman received the news on his deathbed. He smiled and spoke of his joy, not for conquest, but for what it meant. Bursa was not just a city, it was the future. He entrusted Orhan not only with a realm, but with an idea, that justice, unity, and divine purpose must guide the sword. He is said to have offered his son final counsel: protect the poor, uphold the law, honour the scholars, and rule not for vanity, but for virtue. Shortly thereafter, Osman passed away, sometime around 1326. He was laid to rest in Bursa, the city he had dreamt of more than conquered. Over his tomb would rise the first echoes of an empire. And so ended the life of Osman, not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet passing of a dream into new hands. But the dream itself, that was only beginning. Orhan would expand it, Murad would shape it, and Mehmed would lift it to the heavens. But this was the first stone, planted in soil made sacred not by blood alone, but by belief. From the steppes to Söğüt, from tent to city, from whisper to destiny, the Ottomans had begun their march, and the world was watching.